tatta dhim tatakita dhim tadim tattam.
One of the common questions I get asked in my programs is the question about resistance and surrender. Should we always surrender and accept? Is it bad to resist? The current course that I'm doing is called Sattva, and it is about the interstices, or those experiences and the intelligence between two opposite conclusions or two dualistic propositions. For example, good and evil, or right and wrong, or in this case, between surrender and resistance. And I want to share with you a very simple but beautiful story which I hope will illustrate for you what is this interstice space in an archetypal way. So this is a story about a young boy who has a father who is a very powerful king. Now this king assumes that he is immortal because he thinks that he has received a boon from the gods for immortality. He's actually not immortal, but that's what he assumes. And no sooner than he assumes immortality that he unleashes a reign of terror and brutality. This is also illustrative of the nature of our mind, of our ego, our mental consciousness. And that is that even if we just assume we are immortal, that is enough to make our minds and our mental consciousness really brutal. Anyhow, this king is unable to convince his own son. He's able to terrify everybody else, and he is dominating earth, but he is not able to convince his own son about his power. His son continues his invocation of the divine as something more expansive and immanent everywhere. Now, this irks the father no end. Can you imagine? Here is this very powerful king of earth, and what is threatening him is his little son. Isn't that the nature of our ego as well? That even when we think we're immortal and we think that nothing should threaten us once we are immortal, but the truth is that we probably will feel even more insecure at the slightest sign of what we might think is threatening us. So the father tries to do all sorts of things to his own son. He tries to poison him, throw him off the cliff. Anyway, the son survives all this. And finally, in absolute frustration, the father says, all right, you tell me that the divine is immanent everywhere. And he looks at this pillar in his palace and he says, is the divine in this pillar? And the son says very confidently, yes. And so he takes a mace, which is this weapon, and he smashes the pillar. And no sooner he smashes it than is released from this pillar this man or human lion, terrifying human lion, which explodes out of this pillar and destroys this king. What we are attending to here is the pillar and this explosive emergence. It is called stamba, the archetypal practice in dance of the pillar. And the emergence, the explosive emergence, is the pralaya, or the great flood. So you have the pillar and the great flood. So what is asked of us, or what is the invitation in an archetypal way, is that we don't have to resist, neither do we have to accept, but we stand our ground. But how do we stand our ground? We don't stand our ground in just some kind of neutral stillness, but we are the pillar that holds that human lion within. So we stand pregnant with potential, with incredible energy, with aliveness and with passion. That's how we stand. And when we can hold that stance, then that release or the explosion, the great flood, will happen. It will happen. It's almost like it's inevitable. You know, when there is a kind of build-up of potential energy at a certain moment, it must be released. And it's like that with the pillar. So when we build up that potential energy, really alive and passionate, there will be, due to circumstances and the consciousness around us, a moment where there is this explosive or this release into the world. Is the great flood a bad thing? Well, it depends. It depends on the perspective. if you want to resist the great flood or if you want to try and swim in it, it's a bad thing. But if you can allow the flood to take you, so the destruction of the king, in a way, the dissolving of the king, is also in the story, it is considered moksha or liberation, because it's almost like this divine consciousness dissolves this mind, this ego, this hubris that wants to keep us separate and wants us to have these paradigms of control and domination. That is dissolved. It's like I often use the image of a surfer on this big wave. So it's like this beautiful surfing of the wave that is possible when we have that skill to actually be able to find that interstice between trying to control and trying to stand still and resist. So I hope that this gives you a little bit of a taste of this interstice space, which is so important in archetypal traditions, because archetypes are not really about dualities. Sometimes people talk about archetypal traditions as the battle between good and evil, and I feel while that may be useful, it's a very reductionist reading, because what they are is they are actually multidimensional spaces, those spaces in between our conclusions.